welcome back. So we are for the next session. So Professor Vikas Mikrotra joining us from Canada. So thanks again, yes, so for this like 9-hour difference. And with a very intriguing question. So who is the boss? So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annette. Thanks for the invitation. And let me begin by sharing the screen. So this is family control without ownership, evidence from publicly traded Japanese firms, and it is joint work with Morten Bennetson, who's here at this conference, and Jung-wook Shim, who's at the Kyoto Sangyo University in Japan, and Yupana Vivatana Kantang, who's at the National University of Singapore. Ownership and control. So we normally think of ownership of any asset as essentially the right to exclude others from using that asset. And in the context of the modern firm, this definition is often associated with share ownership of equities. And when each share carries one vote, the cash flow rights and the voting rights are perfectly aligned, and control is then often characterized in terms of voting rights. So the question we have is control disproportionate to ownership possible? Now we know the answer from, for example, from dual class shares, which offer one mechanism of separating control from proportionate ownership. In the extreme, using non-voting and voting shares, control can be exercised with an arbitrarily small ownership. Pyramidal ownership structures provide another mechanism for driving this wedge between ownership and de facto control. Work by Masulis, Pham, and Zine in 2014 documents the presence of both of these mechanisms, dual class shares, as well as pyramidal ownership structures, as control enhancing mechanisms quite often used among family firms to maintain control. What the question we are really asking is control possible without ownership, without any of these control enhancing mechanisms that we mentioned earlier? And here the evidence is scant. Anecdotal evidence examples can be found suggesting specific instances where this has happened. For example, take the US jam maker Smuckers. It is still managed by the 5th generation heirs of the founding Smuckers family. The company was founded in the 19th century, decades after the founding family's ownership stake has dropped well below the 10% threshold. Now, to be totally fair, Smuckers has a very unusual ownership structure where the length of time that you hold the shares matters in terms of how many votes are attached to each share. Specifically, if you hold the shares for 4 years or longer, you get 10 times as many votes compared to shares that are held for less than 4 years. Here's another example. Banco Santander is another case. Ana Botín is the current chair of the board of directors of this bank, Banco Santander, and the 4th generation member of the Botín family to hold this position. But if you look at the ownership, actual ownership of the Botín family in the Santander Banco group, that amounts to less than 0.15%. Now, so how common are these cases? How common are such firms? What do we know about these firms where control is still in the hands of the founding family, but ownership has largely disappeared? And the answer is very little. We know very little about such companies. The vast literature on family firms has either ignored such firms or mixed them with family firms that have significant ownership stakes, or sometimes even mix them or group them with non-family firms. So in this study, we address this, this important gap in the literature. So we have three main contributions. Starting with the first one, we document significant and pervasive presence of control in the absence of ownership in post-war Japan. We document the absolute and the relative performance of these companies, how they are formed, and their eventual fate. The second contribution is we provide an extensive survey of the literature with a particular focus on the various definitions of family firms that are used in these studies and the criteria that are employed for these definitions. The tremendous heterogeneity in the criteria used to define family firms essentially has led to a situation where virtually any inference regarding their performance can be drawn depending on the precise definitions that you use to identify family firms. And lastly, the survey reveals that firms with dynastic CEOs without ownership likely exist in other countries, but they get blended in with either family firms or with non-family firms, depending on the definition employed to define family firms in various studies. Bottom line, we have very little standalone evidence on what these firms are, where they come from, where they go, what their performance is, and so on. The third contribution of our study is that we explored the factors that are associated with the formation and retention of firms with family CEOs in the absence of ownership. And these factors are associated, are drawn both from finance, which are well known, as well as from family assets to explore what explains the formation of such firms. So here's a graph from a study by Franks et al. In 2012 that looks at the decline of ownership concentration in two countries, in Japan and the United Kingdom. And if you look at the bottom line there, it says C3 equal to JP. So that is the top 3 shareholders in Japanese companies. And as you can see, that has seen a secular decline from 1900. There's a sharp discontinuity in 1950. That was the occupation of Japan by the general headquarters, when for a brief while, Japanese ownership structure became extremely amorphous, extremely diffused. But then it reverted back to a slight bit more of concentration. But the trend is pretty obvious here as well. Gone family. The ownership pattern that we showed you would give you the impression that families have largely been banished from controlling corporate assets in these two countries. Our paper is the first to test and dispel that impression. We show that a singular focus on ownership misses much of the action in how families control their assets. Why look at Japan? It has to do with data. We choose to focus on Japan as we were able to construct a very rare 50-year panel of the universe of all publicly owned firms, publicly listed firms in Japan from 1950, when the stock exchanges reopened after the war. And we tracked them till 2000. Specifically, we focus on firms that were founder or family firms at the time of the IPO and analyze the evolution of ownership and control in IPO time. And an advantage of focusing on Japan is the absence of both dual class shares as well as pyramidal ownership structures that are common in other parts of Asia, indeed the world. Thus, the typical cash flow versus voting control wedge is largely absent in Japan. This is important in addressing the question of control in the absence of ownership. So here's a quick look at the listings, IPOs in Japan from 1949 till 2000. And you can see two big spikes here. One is in 1949, 1950, when the stock exchanges reopened. And not surprisingly, there was a whole bunch of new listings. And then a second spike occurs in 1960, 61, 62, when the second tier of the Tokyo Stock Exchange was opened. The orange and blue segments of these bars represent family and non-family firms at the time of the IPO. Let me begin by providing you with three cases that exemplify what we mean by control in the absence of ownership. We begin with Casio, the textbook case of active and passive ownership dilution. We next move on to Toyota, which has to do with horizontal cross ownership structures. And then we talk about Suzuki, which has a very unique succession practice for the last several generations. Here's a picture of actual share ownership by the founding family in these three cases. The top line is green. That represents Casio. And as you can see here, let me see if I can enlarge this. So as you can see, somewhere in 1970, 69, when the company was listed, 60% of the shares were in the hands of the founding family. And then that keeps declining, both, as I talked about earlier in the morning, both in the form of active dilution as well as passive dilution. When the company was listed on different exchanges, it keeps declining till today. The ownership of the Casio family is less than 6%. Similarly, if you look at Toyota, the ownership back in 1960 was about 4.8%, and this is largely in the ballpark of less than 5%. And this is not even direct ownership. This is not direct ownership by the Toyota family. This is the ownership by Toyota Industries, in which Toyota family may have a little bit of shares. Even there, the ownership is less than 5%. They don't belong in the top 10 share owners. Below these graphs, we have these little arrows that point different successions. For example, if you look at Toyota, the first one you see is right here, when Fukio Nagakawa became the non-family CEO of the company between 1961 and 1967. He was succeeded by a family CEO, Shunzo. Sorry, I don't have the name here. And then Eiji Toyoda became the CEO between 1967 and 1981. And then in the 1990s, we reverted back to a professional non-family CEO, Hiroshi Okuda, between 95 and 99. And this was followed again in 1999 by Akio Toyoda becoming the CEO of Toyota Motor Company. And he is now represents the CEO of Toyota going back to a family member. Suzuki is interesting. Suzuki has always been in the control of the Suzuki family. Even though if you look at their share ownership, that is right about where the vertical intercept is 0. So even with 0 ownership, the Suzuki family, third generation Suzuki family, in fact, the 4th generation Suzuki family is now in charge of running this company with 0 ownership. This is the Casio founders of the Casio company, Toshio, Kazuo, Tadao, and Yukio. They founded this company in the late 1940s. In 1957, the company was renamed Casio Keisanki Casio Computers. It was listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange in 1970, at which point the Casio family retained 60% of ownership. 3 years later, the company was listed on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, and the Cascio family stake reduced as a result of passive dilution. Again, in 1979, the company sought another listing at the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, further reducing the ownership of the Cascio family. In 1990, direct ownership by the Cascio family was less than 8%. And by 2014, direct ownership by the Cascio family was actually less than 4%. And yet in 2015, Kazuhiro Cascio was appointed as the next president of this company. By the way, in Japan, there is no CEO position. The president is actually the CEO. To put these numbers in perspective that we just mentioned for the Casio computers, the average ownership by the least and most restrictive definitions used in the seminal study by Villalonga and Amit is 16% and 28%. So the numbers that we're showing you of 4% or lower is considerably below the thresholds used in the literature to define family firms. So who are the owners? Financial institutions and foreign investors are the largest owners of Casio. Toyota Motors, this is Kiichiro Toyoda. He was the president of Toyota Motors from 1936 when he became the first president. He actually started the Toyota Motor Company as a spin-off from the Toyota Sewing Machine Company back in 1936. This was their first model, this car that you see on your screen here. And he unfortunately didn't do very well because of many exogenous considerations. And in 1949, the company was struggling under bankruptcy. In 1952, he still served as president, but it wasn't until the late 60s when a Toyota family member was brought back as a CEO of the company. In the meantime, if you look at the ownership structure of Toyota from 1962 to 2015, nowhere in the top 10 owners do you see the Toyota family appearing in the ownership structure of this company. Often you see something like Toyota Industries appearing. This was in 2000. They held 5.3% of the shares of Toyota Motor Company. And then in 2015, the same Toyota Industries holds 6.5% of the shares of Toyota Motor Company. So Toyota Industries is part of what we normally consider the horizontal keiretsu involving the Toyota group. So these are the web of horizontal cross shareholdings that Japan is quite popular for. The picture that you see here is of Mr. Akio Toyoda. He was brought back as the CEO after the company was managed by a professional non-family CEO in the 1990s. And he has been the CEO of Toyota Motor Company since 2009, after a brief hiatus when the company was run by professional managers. Again, all of this happened in the face of insignificant share ownership by the Toyota family. This is Mr. Osamu Suzuki. He is the chairman of the board of Suzuki Motor Company. It was founded as a loom company back in 1909 by Michio Suzuki. And the first car appeared in 1937. In 1949, after the war, Suzuki was listed on the Japanese stock exchanges, including Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. The current chairman is Mr. Osamu, and he's the fourth adopted son-in-law to run the firm. Toshihiro Suzuki is the president, and he's the first biological heir to occupy the position after the premature death of Osamu's adopted son-in-law, who was being groomed to be the next CEO of Suzuki Motor Company. So Suzuki has decided that as a tradition, they will not promote blood sons to the position of CEOs. Rather, in Suzuki Motor Company, the adopted sons have been promoted as the CEOs. including Mr. Osamu. He himself was adopted. And just for those of you who are not familiar with the Japanese adoption system, in Japan, Japan rates along with the US as one of the countries with the highest adoption rates in the world. The difference between Japan and the US is that in the US, the vast majority, more than 90% of the adoptees are babies. By contrast, in Japan, more than 90% of the adoptees are adult males. This gives you a picture of the ownership of Suzuki Motor. Again, nothing different from what you saw as the ownership structure of Toyota. These are all financial institutions, including two at the bottom representing foreign investors. BlackRock is there, and the Vanguard Group is there as well. What is interesting is that if you look at the ownership structures of the top 10, 2.2% gets you in this list, 2.2%. So anything below this list obviously is less than 2.2%. So these three cases show dynastic CEOs without ownership. And in each of these cases, founding families are able to exercise control rights despite having very little ownership. The mechanisms employed may differ. For example, in the case of Casio, the founding members lost ownership via passive dilution, via growth and retained control, mainly because of talent. For Toyota, the control came from a web of cross shareholdings, despite the family having virtually no ownership in the company. And for Suzuki, the succession involves a series of adult adoptions, only recently broken because, as I mentioned, of the premature death of the adopted son-in-law. Where do founding families go? Families don't appear to exit their firms lock, stock, and barrel. Instead, we document three distinct exit modes for families. The most common involves giving up day-to-day management to professional managers while retaining material ownership. The second most common form of exit for families is a dilution of ownership to insignificant levels, but a retention of the family's top management reins. And this is the subject of today's discussion, at least for our paper. And finally, the least popular form of exit for families is selling out their ownership and packing their bags from the company in toto. To better understand these exit modes, we categorized family firms into a 2x2 grid as follows. So in this grid, in this 2x2 grid, we have ownership as column 1, no ownership in the second column. In the first row, we have management control. In the second row, we have no management control. So what does that mean? It means, suppose you look at companies where the founding family has significant ownership as well as they retain management control. In this case, we classify these companies as type 1 companies. So these are the most traditional, talked about, popular family firms in the literature where the founding family has both ownership as well as the CEO's position, or at least top management positions. You also have cases where the family has the CEO's position, but they don't have any material ownership. And in about 1/3 of all transitions that we see, we notice that the transition involves going from type 1 to type 2, which is essentially a loss of ownership, but no loss in terms of top management position. About 60% of transitions that we see involve the family retaining ownership, but transferring the job of the CEO to professional managers. This is sort of what the Chandlerian transformation that was talked about 100 years ago by Chandler and so on. And only in the minority of cases, less than 3% of cases, at least in the Japanese sample, do we see an absolute exit by family firm by selling out. So as I said again, our focus here is on these guys, is on type 2 companies where the family has very little ownership, but somehow they have managed to retain the CEO's position within the family. How do these transitions affect the count of family firms in the literature? Okay. So let me show you what the type 1, type 2, type 3 percentages would look like in IPO time. So we count time 0 as the IPO year. And as you can see, the blue segment here represents type 1 firms where the founding family has both ownership as well as a top management position. But as you can see, by the time you come to year 7, already the orange and the blue bars are roughly the same. The orange bar represents type 2 companies, where the family's ownership has been diluted to insignificant levels, but the family is still in charge of running these companies as the CEO. Okay. By the way, the top, the gray segment here is kind of flat. It doesn't change in IPO time. And it's about 10% of family firms in Japan appear to favor professional managers running their company, even while they are the dominant owners. They are not the focus of this study. I've decided to put them here to show you what the evolution of family firms is in IPO time. So if you look at this picture, this is based on defining family firms as those where the family owns 20% or more of shares, which is the most common definition used in the literature. What if you change the definition from 20% to 5%? Does the problem go away? I think there's a clarifying question. I thought there was a question. No? Okay. So even at 5% in IPO time, you can still see that the presence of type 2 firms is diminished, but not gone. We still have several cases, a significant number of cases, where the family occupies a CEO's position, even though they don't have any significant shares in the company anymore. So this is just a look at the time series of type 2 companies from 1955 onwards. I think there is a question. How do we get to the question?
No, because it was just telling that you have what 5 minutes so that we can leave time for discussions, a bit of questions and answers.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Annette. Thank you for reminding of the times. Let me rush through this a little bit quicker then. So what we see here is a time series of type 2 firms in Japan. And let me show you the next slide here to show you that this appears to coincide with the Nikkei index. So the blue line here represents the Nikkei 225 stock market index, and the red line, the red bars here rather, are the number of firms with founding family CEOs without significant ownership. So it appears to be pro-cyclical in terms of the stock market correlations. So the first contribution, as we mentioned earlier, dynastic CEOs with little family ownership are more common than we thought. In fact, in the literature on family firms, they are conspicuous only by their standalone absence. Let's move on to number 2. Number 2 is we conduct an extensive survey of family firms in this study. And here we survey 100 studies spanning both finance and management journals. And the main purpose of the survey is to highlight the diversity in how family firms are defined and in describing the key variables that these definitions are based on. There is no consensus on what these definitive identifiers of family firms are or should be, but we do note that the definitions seem to vary along 2 key dimensions: ownership and de facto control. So more than 50% of the papers employ some sort of an ownership threshold to define family firms. In most cases, the equity ownership is defined as a fraction of outstanding shares, with only a handful of studies defining ownership based on the fraction of actual voting. In about 10% of the studies that we have collated here, ownership in excess of a threshold and top management position. So it's an and criterion that is used. You have to have both a CEO position and a threshold ownership. And in about 15% of the studies that we have examined, the top management position alone is sufficient to qualify as a family firm status. The bottom line here is that, let me just go to the bottom line here, that the kinds of firms we are looking at in this study, what we call type 2 firms, where you have the CEO belonging to a founding family with little ownership, about 24% of the T2 firms in our sample would be classified as family firms in the literature, along with any kind of firms that has significant ownership. Whereas more than 70% of the papers that we surveyed in the literature would classify the companies like Toyota and Suzuki and Casio as non-family firms. And that's a staggering bias in the literature. That was the second contribution. The last idea here is that what are the factors that give rise to how these firms come about, how we transition from a company that has both ownership and the CEO's position to a company where the ownership is gone, but the CEO is still retained by the founding family. So in the interest of time, let me just quickly show you what determines the ownership transition from type 1, which is the founding family has ownership as well as the CEO's position, to type 2 firms where the founding family has lost their ownership position, but they still retain the CEO's position. And what we notice here is that financial constraints are the key determinants, as expected, because your ownership is diluting. So growth is the imperative that has driven you here. So what we find in these transitions, in these logit regressions here, is that the higher leverage firms are more likely to transition to type 2. Equity issuance increases the odds, so does firm size. And all of these three variables support the role played by finance in generating type 2 firms. Who are the family CEOs that do not have ownership? They tend to be younger, but they tend to have longer CEO tenures compared to professional CEOs. They're more likely to have attended elite universities in Japan compared to founding family members, compared to type 1 CEOs. And the prior ownership stakes don't help. In fact, there's a negative association. It is not friends and network. Transitions are less likely when you have stable ownership. Okay. And finally, how do you lose this CEO position when you don't have ownership? And that's a transition from type 2 to an exit to type 4 companies. And what you see here is that legacy matters a great deal. What is legacy? We define legacy as cases where the firm name and the founding family's names are identical. And what we see here is that in cases where you have legacy as an asset, these transitions are inhibited. That means you're more likely to keep control in the hands of the founding family, even when your ownership is inconsequential. Finance is less important in these transitions because these transitions do not involve a change in ownership. Okay. Let me stop here in the interest of time. These were the three main contributions of the study, and I look forward to the comments from the discussants. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Vikas, for your presentation. So now the first discussion, the academic discussion by August Khan Karkas, that joins us from Cambridge.
Thank you, Annette. Can you hear me and see my slides?
We can hear you, but we do not see your slides yet.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Do you see my slides now?
Yes.
Perfect. It's a great pleasure to discuss this paper. Thank you very much, Annette, for organizing this and inviting me. And I quite enjoyed reading this paper. I think it's a rather thoughtful paper. In the discussion, I'll try to basically summarize what the paper does. I think Vikas did an excellent job, very clear presentation. And I'll try to basically then give some comments to perhaps to extend the paper to its fullest extent and some other basically suggestions. Here's the summary of the paper in a nutshell, at least for me. The paper, first of all, refines the family ownership. And what it is basically arguing that the previous literature was mostly focusing on the ownership structure, but maybe we should also take into account the control allocation as well. Therefore, it essentially introduces one more dimension. Therefore, the family firm definition becomes more complicated. And now there is this grid where there is the family ownership, and there's the family CEO, which is kind of a traditional family firms that we would think, which is the type 1. And then there is type 2, where there is less ownership, very little ownership, sometimes no ownership, but still there is family control. And then there is a type 3, where there is family ownership, but the family is not running the firm. And the type 4 is basically it is not a family firm. What the paper basically says is that, look, this type 2 is rather important, where basically there is less family ownership, but still family is in control. Therefore, it matters. And in fact, when they look at the Japanese firms, they are looking at the publicly listed Japanese firms between 1949 to 2000, with more than 30,000 firm year observations. They find that depending on how you define the family ownership, say 5% or 20% cutoff, about 10 to 30% of the listed Japanese firms do indeed fall into the category of type 2. And hence, what basically they are saying that if we do not take into account of this control allocation in mind, we may be misclassifying these family firms as non-family firms. And I just basically called this type 2 error. I think it nicely coincides. I don't know whether that was intentional by the authors, but the type 2 error in statistical terms that, these are family firms or can be considered as family firms, but are not classified as family firms. That's number one. After establishing this, then the paper wants to understand, obviously, how things evolve and whether we can learn more. Because I think in the interest of time, didn't have too much time to elaborate on that, only in the very last part of his presentation, he touched upon that. But basically what the paper is saying that the previous literature, because it focuses on kind of a more broader definition of family firms, let's think that the previous, just basically loosely speaking, the previous literature is focusing on type 1 firms as the family firms and type 4 firms as the non-family firms in just one dimension, basically. It was finding that these financial variables, like the size of the firm, perhaps the liquidity, etc., is very important in explaining why there is a family ownership and why there is an exit from the family ownership. However, once these authors are introducing the second component, the second dimension of control allocation, and particularly basically highlighting these type 2 firms, they are finding that in fact, the family assets, the value that this family is bringing to the firms also is rather important as the financial variables overall. And if you particularly pay attention to the switches between type 1 to type 3 and type 2 to type 4, these red and green, which is red is the table 6 and green is the table 7, they find that basically in both cases the ownership is kept the same, but the control allocation changes. In those cases, the family assets in fact play a more important role than the financial variables. And among the family assets, what they are basically uncovering, two important variables, which is one is the legacy. I think they also call it eponymy. Sorry if I am, let me just, this is this Greek word. Basically whether this name of the family is in the title of the firm. And the second is the talents of the family, whether they are part of an elite education. I will come back to these family assets and legacy issue. Now, my comments, the first comment is, I think the paper makes I think a very convincing argument that these type 2 firms, these are the low ownership and still retaining the control, is important, and it could be creating errors. But from the discussion in the paper, it also seems that this is rather specific to Japan. You know, there is a few scattered examples, it seems, other places as well, as Vikas also mentioned. But from the reading of the paper, it seems this is something specific to Japan. Then that kind of brings the question of how useful is this refined family ownership classification, or these errors that we are making in classification of the family firms, if such thing is not prevalent in other countries. But having said that, what I thought was maybe this could be also interesting in a sense that if it is specific to Japan, then the question is, why is this specific to Japan? And maybe we should try to understand why in Japan, we observe so many of such basically type 2 firms. And I think one clue could be something that Vikas also highlighted, is that in Japan, control enhancing mechanisms, say particularly these dual class structures, are not allowed. Then I was curious, maybe this is why such basically type 2 firms have evolved over time in Japan, because such dual class structures are not allowed. And if that is the case, then perhaps we would observe such basically structures in other countries that ban dual class shares. And then maybe we can conclude this could be the place to look, maybe, if such examples exist. This thing brought to my mind that in the United States, NYSE didn't allow the dual class firms between 1926 and 1988. And maybe if one looks at these IPOs around those times, maybe one could observe a similar pattern, which would be, I think, interesting. This could have already been done in the literature. I just wanted to basically bring this to the author's attention. Picking up on these dual class shares, I was also thinking that perhaps these dual class shares could be a fruitful comparison setup as well, because when I saw that this legacy variable, whether the title of the founder, whether the name of the founder is in the title of the firm, is rather important as a family asset, it immediately reminded me the Gomper's paper, Gomper's asymmetric paper on dual class firms. The reason it reminded me is because when they look at what determines the dual class status in the US, the most powerful predictor is whether a person's name appears in the company name at IPO. And I was thinking perhaps this could be the Rosetta Stone that connects these dual class structures and basically your study of these type 2 errors. They also mention in the same paper that while this name variable is new, the result that family ownership is predictive of dual class status is shown in other samples as well. That's why I thought this dual class shares comparison could be helpful to maybe further look. Regarding the measurement, I was thinking that, again, the main variable that is basically the main focus of the paper is type 2 firms, where ownership is low, but they still control the firm. Then I was thinking maybe could there be some role of these secret offshore vehicles hiding perhaps some of the ownership? And this way, maybe it may look that they don't have much ownership, but maybe through other means, they do have that ownership. And I was thinking maybe this leak of Panama papers could be exploited. There is already a paper in RFS by O'Donovan, Wagner, and Zuma. This might be perhaps an interesting venue to pursue. I also thought, related to this, is perhaps the trusts could be playing a role in family ownership as well. In the paper, when the family firm is being defined, the authors say that they look at the family plus the foundations, but they don't talk about trusts. Therefore, I am not sure whether they use trusts. They check the trusts, whether the family's hidden ownerships or indirect ownerships through the trusts are counted. The reason I mention also this is in Villalonga and Amit. They say that the most commonly used investment vehicle for indirect ownership of US family firms are trusts. Therefore, I think together with these offshore vehicles, these two things seem the first order places to look and perhaps to refine even further these type 2 firms. these trusts also brought me another idea to me, and this is why I thought the paper is really thoughtful. It in fact touches upon many other things, and if among the audience, if there's any legal scholars, perhaps they will build upon that as well. When I was thinking about these type 2 firms, particularly in Japan, it gave me this feeling that they have a flavor of a trust. These trusts. My wife is a lawyer, and she is now preparing. She's a Turkish qualified lawyer, and now she's preparing to pass the UK common law. And she was telling me these trusts are really interesting organizations. And there's historical linkages, etc. But one of the key usages, as I understand from discussion with her as well, is that these trusts are useful to separate these bundles of rights, these cash flows and voting rights. And when the authors are talking about these family assets, I was thinking loosely that perhaps these family assets are transferred by the founder, which I would say the truster in quotation, to the family CEO as the trustee in quotation, for the benefit of family and shareholders as beneficiaries. In a sense, it has this, to me, it gives a flavor of trust, which may be useful again to benchmark and maybe get some insights from that literature as well. My last 2 comments is that when the authors mention about the contribution to the literature, I do agree what they say. And I thought maybe there could be one more kind of linkage to the literature where, there's, relatively recent papers, including one of them is mine, is showing that small percentage of ownership could be impactful. In a sense, like with this paper with Alroy, Dimson, and Shi Li at RFS, we are finding that engagement of institutional investors for ESG reasons could be rather impactful. If you look at each individual investor, since they are large investors investing in large firms with small ownership, they may look to have very small ownership, but by basically collaborating, they can increase their impact. And there is also this interesting work I quite like by Castile, which the title of his paper is Against All Odds, where he is looking at how the hedge fund activism happens in companies which are already controlled. Therefore, basically there is, say, a majority control, like a majority control block of, say, 60%. Therefore, when you do an activism, there is no way you would get the majority control. But nevertheless, you still see this hedge fund activism. And they are basically emphasizing that in such activisms, the control is being affected through the reputation mechanisms or legal, basically suing mechanisms, etc. This is another contractual rights, which I think the paper, in a sense, also contributes that literature that small percentage of ownership could indeed be impactful. And the last point is, obviously, I realize that this is rather tedious and incredible amount of work, but perhaps it just looks, I guess one wants to see even further, like when you come to 2020, to see what happens with the ownership structure, if that is feasible. I think these are my comments. I hope you find them useful. I quite enjoyed the paper, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for Augustin for comments, and so I will go forward to Vikas after the practical discussions comments, and then maybe if Vikas wants you to share the slides, then you can return. Yeah. So, but now. Let me introduce Anta Pradnievica. So she's from the leading executive search and development company in Latvia, and she will give like an HR perspective on this topic. And so, what are the kind of issues the managers find in succession and transfers of business family firms? Yeah. So please. And yes, so we will put on the slide.
Thank you.
Just a second, yeah. Yep. And pointer, yes.
Thank you. This was very interesting article and very interesting topic to think about. And my focus will be more on Baltic states and more on organizations in Baltic states. But what I find really interesting was those 4 types of organizations. And when trying to analyze how they come into the picture in Baltic states, I had to admit that mostly we have type 1, and family owns and manages this company, and family 3, when family type 3, when family owns the company, but it is managed by the professional executive. Lately, in the last few years, we also see the rise of type 4, that family understands that they don't want to manage the company anymore and actually sells it to either investors or the third parties. Thus, this presentation also will be more focusing on the type 1 and type 3 organizations and the good and bad examples that we see in one or another. Regarding the bad examples, let's start with those ones. When we are going into the companies, we are often doing the compensation systems, job evaluations, and it is common that in family-owned companies, we come to the point when we are asking, so what this position is doing, and they say, well, maybe we can skip this position because it's not real, and if we have to be honest, it's tailor-made for one specific person, which turns out to be either a spouse, a kid for the manager, or the parent of the manager. And in those cases, nobody can really explain why they have this position and how it comes into the organization structure. There might be the situation, example from the life, family-owned organization, and then there is suddenly PR specialist, although the company really doesn't need one. The company doesn't have any marketing activities, and they do not have any PR issues to solve as well. But they have the PR specialist because it turns out that the kid of the manager has just finished the university in the PR field, and they just want to do something. Quite similar situations comes out when the family member is actually holding the post, which is important for the company and which is a real post, but the family member is not really competent for this post. There was the situation that the spouse was put in the marketing department, and well, he was not doing so well. And he was not only making bad decisions for marketing, but he was also disturbing the other colleagues and the other employees. There's like unwritten rule in those family-owned companies that you never complain about unprofessional family member, that you just keep it to yourself. So those actions were escalating so far that the manager, who didn't feel that actually she could fire him, decided to get some distractions, some other projects, so they could actually hire the other person who can do the job. And finally, example is about relatively young family members. Usually those are kids of the owners who has just finished the universities. And then they are granted the managerial position right away. So you got this education, usually very good education, now you can manage the company. And the result usually is quite a big failure, because those kids, as smart as they are, they really need to learn some life lessons and understand how everything operates. So there was one client who actually admitted the mistake and said, so never let your kid to get the first managerial experience in your organization. Let them make those mistakes somewhere else and then come back. That is definitely one way how to look at it. But then there is also one really good example which I liked the most. It is actually the family-owned company from Sweden. They are already 3 generations in the organization, and they have this unwritten rule that nobody of the family can take the post unless they are applying through official recruitment process. And the fact that the family member owns a part of the company, some amount of shares, doesn't guarantee the post in the company. They have understood that only professionals can actually act in the best interest of the companies. So if the family member wants to become, let's say, development department director, they need to apply and they need to prove that they are actually the best candidates in the market. They usually are, because they know the company very well. They are trained for that for the whole life. They spend a lot of time together with the managers of the company, so they have a lot of inside information and they care about the company. Still, they need to go through this standard procedure of recruitment. And it actually gives a lot of bonuses for the company. The employees, the other employees who are not family members, see that the process is transparent, that the one who is put into the post is there not because of the family connections, but because of the professionality. So they trust and they respect the new manager more. So what is the other issue that we have noticed in the family organizations, family-owned organizations? So there was mentioned before earlier this day that there could be the shock that the founder of the company or the idea author passes away. So it has been several cases actually that we have followed that if the heirs, actually those who own the company afterwards, doesn't know what to do with the company, doesn't see the same vision, the same idea, the company can actually end up in quite big financial problems because there is nobody who is leading the company in the same direction. The other examples comes actually that even if there is not a shock, but let's say that the founder of the company has chosen the firstborn son to be successor of the company, but turns out that he lacks any leadership capabilities or any interest in the industry where the organization is operating. It could also lead towards disaster and closure of the company. Son won't be interested to take the right decisions, or will be interested to get out of the company as soon as possible. The opposite thing is actually if the successor is chosen because of the interest in the field. There is also a very good example of the son who was really interested in the family business, and after finishing the university, joined the company, and joined the company not as the manager, but actually as an employee. So he started from the very basics. Then he was building his way up, followed by the manager of the division, then manager of the branch. And when the time came, he was completely capable actually to take over the company. I also like that in the paper, there was often mentioned that in Japan, the heirs actually, or the next generation, take over when they are old enough, and this old enough is usually 50. In Baltic states, we probably have a different perception about that, and 30, 40 is good enough, but this maturity is really needed for the managers who are taking over the companies. So the conclusion is that it is very important to pay attention of how to choose whether the family member should take over the company after next generation, and the family member could be the best candidate. They know the company, they know the history, they know the culture of the company. They can understand how the processes are organized and why it is so. and they are the most motivated candidates for the job, and probably don't need to be rewarded based on the share value. In the same time, if not chosen very carefully, it could also end up badly and lead company towards the ending.
Okay, thank you very much, Anta. Mark, is it okay if we steal a bit of your presentation so that we kind of postpone for 10 minutes? So Mark,
that's fine.
That's fine, perfect. Yeah,
No
so we have a break afterwards, so we kind of chip in that a little bit. Yeah, so please, Rushan, I think you would like to answer to some of Vika's comments. If you want some slides back, okay, Vikas?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, both discussants, Ojan and Anta. You both did an excellent job with the discussion. So I'm really grateful for that. I don't have anything to reply. I'm just going to wait for any comments that may be there from the audience.
Vikas, how does your picture of type 2 companies change if you expand definition to include chairman of board coming from family, or perhaps board positions in general?
The sample size would increase. Right now, we are only focusing on CEOs, which technically is a position of the president in Japan because there is no CEO position. So we're only looking at presidents. But if you do include the chairman of the board, the sample size will further increase. For example, in the case of Suzuki, Mr. Osamu is the chairman of the board, and well, his biological son is being promoted as the president of the company. So yes, if you do include the chairman's position, the sample size would go up.
Now, it doesn't be a natural way to keep control.
Right, that's a real question. So the chairman position in Japan is a bit more meaningful in terms of executive decision making than it is in the US. In the US, the chairman is largely a governance position. In Japan, the chairman of the board is also involved in executive decisions. So that's a possibility, is to we didn't do that because then instead of CEO, then we have two positions, and that might dilute the emphasis. But you're right, as a robustness test, we could include the chairman's position. We do have the data.
Okay, so Charlotte had questions. So can you please unmute and put on the video? Charlotte?
Okay. No, as I wanted to start by saying I thought that was a super interesting and very fun group of firms to think about. So I have several sort of things that crossed my mind as I was listening to Vikas's presentation. So the first thing is that I was super surprised that there were so many of these type 2 firms in Japan. So I know if you draw that matrix on the Norwegian population of firms, so that is not just listed firms, but both listed and unlisted, type 2 is 3.5%. So it seems like really a lot to have 20% of those. And part of it, that's probably because they're listed, but it also seems like there's something particular about Japan there. So one thing I was sort of wondering as you were talking was ex-ante. So you sort of think about like theory-based, what would you have expected, I mean, to be the reason for why these type of successors are so prevalent in Japan? Is that because, I mean, the sort of caricature explanation that comes to mind is that it has to do with honor and reputation and the family name and that kind of thing. But I don't know, is that just me who has this outdated idea of what Japan is like, or what were you thinking there, ex-ante? Is that I was interested in. And then another thing that came to mind was that this practice of adopted sons-in-laws, because it strikes me that this is not really necessarily all that different from professional CEOs, right? Because there must be some, if you're not born into a rich family and you want to be the CEO of a big company, there is going to be some kind of like marriage market competition that may actually quite resemble the market for professional CEOs, right? I mean, do you have any sense of, you know, how these daughters of these families get courted? Do they tend, so it seems like they tend to find husbands from the best schools in the country. So the point here is, are these really family CEOs, or are they more akin to professional CEOs?
So excellent questions. Your second question is more fully answered in our study, which came out 7 years ago in 2013 in the Journal of Financial Economics. So I can send you that paper, you can have a look. But the bottom line, you're absolutely right there. About 50% of the adopted sons are actually sons-in-law who are actually married to a daughter of the family. And that practice is getting less and less common. Marriage for love has superseded marriage for economic reasons in Japan as well. So that is not surprising. Your first question was, what brings back the family to the CEO's position when they really don't have any shares? And as I said in our logit regressions, a few factors pop out. Legacy is one of them. So clearly that legacy stands for more than just a common name. It has to perhaps proxy for networks that we can't see. So there may be things like that. So the very fact that just having the company's name coincide with your family name increases the odds of type 2 transitions, means there's some family assets this is bringing to the table. Maybe Morten, you can add something to it if you're listening in, Morten. Okay, if you don't want to add something, but this is my feeling, because there are maybe unobservables that we can't find good proxies for in measurement that are behind this, is my best answer for you. But that's something still work in progress, and we might get at these unobservables. Oh, Morten's back. All the hard questions, Morten, is your chance to answer the hard questions.
Also, it's not the 3.8% of probably the same in Denmark, but that's because it's private firms. Private firms you don't control with 3%. Now, the interesting thing, I'm not answering your direct question here, right? Sorry. But I think the interesting thing about these cases outside Japan is that we have found now 3-4 real cases, which seems to be sustainable. But a lot of the cases that we see outside Japan are not time stable. And obviously this is an interesting question that, you know, Cadbury was mentioned in some of the early papers. A few US companies were mentioned as this in some of the early papers, and they all lost. So I think that the unique feature in Japan is really that you know, they can actually keep control without ownership. Which again makes it specific to Japan, but there are cases like the Santander Bank, the Thai Bank. I think also we found a number of cases outside Japan. That was a very random comment. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you, Morten.
So there is a question from Indrait. So Indrait, please unmute yourself.
Thank you, because it's a very nice presentation. I was wondering, do you find the similar kind of trend in some of the Indian firm too? Because if you see the Tatas as well as Birlas, who are quite dominant in the family businesses in India, I find the similar kind of trend also in type 2, whatever you mentioned, also in India. Do you have looked into this matter? So
that's an excellent comment, Njit. And if you look at the Tata, Mr. Tata JRD himself, when he was alive, he was the CEO of Air India. Even though he had 0 shares, It was an airline that he had started back in the 1930s. But when it was nationalized by the Indian government, he had 0 shares, and yet he was asked to continue as the CEO of Air India, even though he had 0 shares. So yes, you're right. There are sporadic examples of type 2 companies. I wouldn't call the Birla Group like that. The Birla Group has considerable, significant ownership in their companies. The Tata is very, very different. The Tata Group is managed by a trust, and that trust is essentially unbreakable. Morton's colleague Steen, who was Morton's colleague, he has written extensively about trust managed companies. In Japan, we don't see these trusts. We just don't see family trusts in Japan. Whether it's a legal impediment or what, I don't know the answer, but we just don't see management by trusts in Japan. But in India, yes, there will be examples. Mr. JRD himself, as I pointed out, is a good example of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.